Welcome to part 2 of today's lecture. In the first half of the lecture, we looked at the case for diplomatic criticism, focusing on 3 reasons. In this part of the lecture, we're going to focus on 2 objections to diplomatic criticism before considering some of the alternative forms of diplomacy. The first response or criticism is that naming and shaming is extremely demanding. It requires of states and other agents too much. By engaging in international criticism, the argument goes, states may, for instance, lose important trade deals. So suppose that the UK were to criticize very heavily Saudi Arabia for its bombing in Yemen. And then in response, Saudi Arabia cuts arms deals with the UK, resulting in the loss of thousands of jobs in the defense industry. Do you think that the UK, in such a case, should criticize Saudi Arabia? Have a pause and have a think. The objection then is that the duty to criticize assumes a particularly demanding form of cosmopolitanism. For those of you that haven't studied it before, cosmopolitanism asserts that individuals and states possess very extensive duties to those beyond their borders. So even if diplomatic criticism would address the situation, this response goes, it would not be permissible because it's adopting too strong a form of cosmopolitanism. It would be, to use terminology we've looked at with just war theory, disproportionate in regard to the internal costs borne by the states, the internal costs. It would be worse than doing nothing, given the costs for the population of the state doing the criticizing. They would be, in other words, excessive. Now, one response to this objection is to suggest that, firstly, diplomatic criticism is in fact a lot cheaper than the other measures that we're going to look at and have looked at already on this course. It's normally free, at least on face value, even if there might be cost to bear in terms of the repercussions. It's certainly much cheaper than economic sanctions, which can harm your own industry, or warfare. And related to this, the second point is that common sense morality appears to hold that the cost that states can be asked to bear in terms of tackling serious human rights abuses may in fact be quite high. It's widely held that states have got a moral duty to undertake humanitarian intervention in response to mass atrocities, for instance. They would have been required to intervene in response to the genocide in Rwanda. As we saw in week 1, this is one of the central notions of the R2P, or the responsibility to protect doctrine. And this is despite the fact that military intervention can be extremely costly. For instance, the cost of the Kosovo intervention in 1999, that we've already come across quite a few times in the module, the cost of this intervention, including the reconstruction phase, is estimated at $46 billion. This is from the report by the International Commission on Intervention, State Sovereignty on the R2P. It's also widely held that states should intervene despite the risk of casualties to their own soldiers when doing so. So the point is this: if we accept that efficacious military intervention to tackle mass atrocities is required despite the costs, and when these costs are very significant, it would also seem that diplomatic criticism could similarly be required if it's going to tackle mass atrocities despite the costs. The second objection to the duty to criticize is that states are not entitled to criticize others in many cases. And this is in particular when they're being hypocritical. That is to say, when states have previously engaged in the same practice or a similar practice, they lose their entitlement to be able to criticize others for engaging in the practice themselves. For engaging in this practice, sorry. So imagine this. Imagine that you criticize your housemate for not doing their washing up in your house. Shared house, they're not doing their washing up. But you don't do your washing up yourself. Is it okay for you to criticize them if it's going to have the effect of getting them to do their washing up? This is a real world case. It happened in my student house when I went an undergraduate in Newcastle. Now, this highlights hypocrisy. And the objection about hypocrisy is one of the most common objections leveled against diplomatic criticism, leveled against naming and shaming. For instance, in response to the US criticism of its human rights record, in 2012, the Russian Foreign Ministry issued a 50-page official report cataloguing American violations of human rights, including rendition, police discrimination, and drone strikes. Last year, something similar happened. In response to the US State Department criticism of China's human rights records, China highlighted human rights abuses in the US, including the high total of gun deaths, racial discrimination, and what it said was a lack of media freedom in the US, where the US government continually publicly and fiercely accuses the media and journalists of creating fake news and of creating an atmosphere of intimidation and hostility. So this is one of the most common objections that you're going to find to virtually all international politics. You'll find it particularly in relation to humanitarian intervention. The objection is that states behave hypocritically because they intervene somewhere, but then support a human rights violating dictator elsewhere. The same might be said of economic sanctions and virtually all the measures that we're going to be considering in this module. So let's look at a bit more detail. A few points worth noting about it. First, the scope of this objection may appear to be very broad. This is because nearly all states in the international system face some human rights abuses internally or have previously engaged in or supported external action that led to human rights abuses. So the 2003 war in Iraq, we know that the UK and US was involved, but it was a coalition made up of more than 40 states, roughly 1 in 5 states in the world. More broadly, the Amnesty International annual reports documents human rights issues in over 150 states. That's by a vast majority of states in the world. So if we give much weight to the wrongness of hypocrisy, if we say hypocrisy is a really important moral concern, very few states in the international system could potentially be able to justifiably engage in international criticism, in naming and shaming of other states over aggression and abuses of human rights. Now, it's worth thinking in a bit more detail about why hypocrisy is wrong to understand this objection fully and to understand the responses to it. Let's think about this intrinsically and instrumentally. Intrinsically, at the interpersonal level, that is, at the level between individuals, hypocrisy seems wrong because, as the philosopher R.J. Wallace argues, it appears to deny the equal moral standing of other agents. So as individuals, we think that the denial of equal standing between, say, sexes and races is a form of disrespect. If we were to say, for instance, that men are not required to give a percentage of their earnings to international charities, but women are, we would think that this is a denial of equal moral standing and that this is baseless and potentially disrespectful to both men and women. At the international level, the worry is very similar. When a state criticizes another, but engages in the same practice itself, it is effectively asserting that the same standards do not apply to it. The perhaps implicit claim is that it is exceptional and superior to other states. Similarly, if we hold at the international level that certain political communities are subject to the rules of the international system, but others are not, there seems to be the morally problematic denial of equal moral standing. So when the US criticizes the human rights record of Russia or China but overlooks its own, it implies that it is not subject to the same moral standing, that it is superior, has a different level. It is, as is sometimes said, exceptional. The US adopts an exceptionalist view of itself. Hypocrisy then, including at the international level, seems morally wrong because it denies the equal moral standing of those who are criticized. And Wallace argues that hypocritical moral dress is inherently objectionable and a significant moral fault since it offends against the commitment to the equality of persons. So that's the intrinsic argument. What about the instrumental one? The claim here is that hypocritical criticism, being hypocritical, is problematic because it can weaken the impact of the hypocrite's critique, even if the critique is actually spot on. This is because the critique lacks credibility. The critique, when the hypocrisy is public, may be regarded with suspicion and then dismissed. So, when you criticize your housemate for not doing the washing up, when you don't do it yourself, you might cultivate cynicism about your criticism. It might seem that you don't really believe that everyone should be doing the washing up and are in fact secretly trying to get them to do yours. At the international level, the same reasoning applies. Hypocrisy appears to show that the norms or laws governing international society are in fact weak or non-existent, since they do not compel action for all. Instead, hypocrisy appears to reaffirm a realist view of the international system, whereby states are simply motivated by narrow material interests and norms have little influence. This is nicely put by Daryl Glazer, who says, when the US behaves hypocritically, it subverts the authority of words used to describe desirable goals such as democracy and human rights. So what does this mean? Does it mean it's never permissible to criticize hypocritically? Is it okay for you still to criticize your housemate for not doing their washing up? Is it still okay for the US or the UK to criticize China and Russia for its human rights records? We can separate two views here. On the first view, the strong view, you might think it's never permissible to be hypocritical. On the more moderate view, however, you might think that you generally shouldn't be hypocritical, but it's still acceptable sometimes. Let's unpack these views a bit more. Why might one hold the moderate view? The reasoning goes like this. Although hypocrisy has some independent moral wrongness, this seems of small moral concern, all things considered. This is because it's attitudinal. And what that means is that it concerns the attitudes that we hold about others' moral standing. It's the attitude or the mindset of being superior. Now, such mindsets are very objectionable, but they don't seem to be of that much importance when considering big questions in international politics, when considering mass atrocities, aggression where thousands of lives are at stake. Much of the intuitive force of what seems to be the intrinsic moral wrongness of hypocrisy doesn't concern the hypocrisy in itself, but in fact, the substantive failure to meet ethical requirements. So what's really wrong about you not doing the washing up isn't the fact that you think you're superior. That's not what's doing the work if you adopt this moderate view. It's simply that you haven't done the washing up. That's what's wrong. And what is wrong with the UK and US not criticizing states with bad human rights records whilst not having perfect human rights records themselves, it's the fact that they don't have good human rights records themselves. It's not about the exceptionalist mindset that this involves. To illustrate this, consider the following case. So suppose that the UK ignores mass atrocities in Yemen because of political interests, which a large party has done, but then criticizes mass atrocities in Syria and others' failure to respond to the situation in Syria, again, which a large party has done. Now, it seems that it should criticize in both cases in Yemen and in Syria. But suppose that if it's failed already to criticize the atrocities in Yemen, it still seems better that it accepts that it is acting hypocritically and still criticizes the mass atrocities going on in Syria. And others failure to respond, even on pain of hypocrisy. Better to criticize on pain of hypocrisy than to do nothing. So although failing to criticize in the case of Syria would be treating both sets of individuals equally, you'd be treating everyone alike, it seems that it's better to treat some well rather than all equally badly. So states can sometimes permissibly and perhaps should criticize even on pain of hypocrisy when doing so asserts that a particular group should not be subject to mass atrocities or serious external aggression. So this is the case in the moderate view. Recall that it says that hypocrisy is wrong, but it doesn't always foreclose hypocritical criticism. Let's now turn to the instrumental claims. On the moderate view, you might still be required to criticize, even if hypocritical, because the effects might not be that bad. In fact, criticism, even if you're hypocritical, might still help. Why is this? Well, hypocritical criticism provides a means by which others can criticize you, the hypocrite, when the hypocrisy is exposed. In short, you should practice what you preach. So back to the washing up example. By asserting that washing up is something that's clearly required, you make it easier for others to criticize you for not washing up, to ensure that you practice what you preach. Now, this might not fully repudiate the negative consequences of hypocrisy. It might not completely show that hypocrisy is always the right thing to do, but it does show that some of the instrumental worries that we've looked at surrounding hypocrisy might not always be that serious. So it might diminish some of the instrumental worries that you would have about hypocrisy. there's another important issue to consider. And this concerns what it actually means to be hypocritical. In other words, it concerns the scope of this hypocrisy objection. The thought here is that the scope of the hypocrisy objection is in fact far smaller than it first seems. The famous liberal political philosopher Jerry Cohen notes in his related discussion of the issue of tu quoque, you too criticisms, that few of us think that no one can call the kettle black who has committed sin of any kind. He argues that to be hypocritical, the sin needs to be of the same kind and the same seriousness. If the sin is of a different kind, it isn't hypocritical. So if you're criticizing others for killing, but you engage in other less serious rights violations, such as denials of freedom of expression, you're not being hypocritical. It's not the same action that you're talking about. He also argues that when the sin is of a lesser quantity, the state is not acting hypocritically when they criticize others. For instance, when the state engages in killing one individual in a bundled police operation, but not mass killing, this isn't hypocritical when you're criticizing others for engaged in mass killing. So the thought here is that hypocrisy needs to be of the same quality, the same degree of rights violations, and the same quantity, the same level of rights violations, the same number of rights violations. And so saying that states can't criticize when they engage in small scale rights violations in terms of the quality of rights violations, and i.e. relatively minor rights violations or only a few individuals, this seems problematic. It seems it needs to be the same scale of rights violations for the action to be hypocritical. So let me summarize this section. We've seen that states should not engage in hypocritical diplomatic criticism, it seems. It seems plausible that they should act rightly and not engage in external and internal aggression themselves. They shouldn't engage in mass atrocities themselves. And they should possess the right attitude to criticize, the right attitude towards others. So they shouldn't be hypocritical. But depending on whether you adopt the strong or moderate or another view, it might seem that if you adopt the moderate view, states can still be hypocritical as long as the criticism will bring about good effects that outweigh the problematic effects of the hypocrisy, such as by highlighting the mass atrocities or advancing norms such as R2P. In other words, for the reasons that we explored in the first part of today's lecture. Okay, now we're going to turn to consider some other diplomatic measures. Spent quite a while considering naming and shaming international criticism, most relevant diplomatic measure for the module, but it's worth looking at some of the alternatives as well. It might be thought that rather than engaging in diplomatic criticism, states should engage in dialogue with those involved in external aggression and mass atrocities. This is because diplomatic criticism may be viewed as megaphone diplomacy, or preaching, and so be unlikely to be effective. The notions of public diplomacy are relationship building and dialogue, which are claimed to be more likely to achieve the broader long-term aims of diplomacy. So you find a lot of the literature on public diplomacy, some of which is on the reading list this week, makes this sort of point. The shared understandings and listening to others' complaints and viewpoints, the argument goes, is much more likely to lead to a shift in behavior than strong rebuke, strong criticism of the offending agents. For instance, criticizing China's human rights records might seem to be unlikely to lead to a shift in policy. Engagement, long-term dialogue, persuasion might be viewed as what's required to lead to a shift. Naming and shaming, which is sometimes called monologue, might be viewed as moralizing and perhaps lead to entrenchment of the position. How strong is the case for dialogue? Well, it seems sometimes clear that it's going to be better than simply preaching. Sometimes states should be wary and not engage in public international criticism. But although dialogue may sometimes succeed, it also seems that it will also fail to tackle the immediate crisis or longer-term human rights abuses. For instance, China might not listen to proclamations of certain states about its human rights records, but it might not also listen to dialogue on this issue either. It might not be open to persuasion. Now, it might seem that giving all parties a voice could sometimes, for dialogue, increase positivity towards opposing viewpoints and lead to a better relations between states. This might sometimes lead to a shift in approach. So perhaps we shouldn't completely rule out dialogue. One way of thinking about it instead is that naming and shaming and dialogue are appropriate in different contexts. In the longer term, dialogue can build trust and friendly relationships that can help to persuade states to shift their outlook and not to engage in aggression. In the shorter term, though, in what we're really concerned with in this module, when there's internal or external aggression is impending or ongoing, it might seem that naming and shaming is preferable, where there's not the time for relationship building and persuasion. Let's now consider another measure. This is the cutting and downgrading of diplomatic ties with a state that's engaged in mass atrocities or external aggression. So there are two immediate attractions of this measure of cutting and downgrading diplomatic ties, diplomatic relations. Firstly, by distancing oneself from the offending state, states can make it very clear that they view the other state as illegitimate. So when they withdraw their ambassadors, their diplomats, when they refuse to have any contacts with the other state in question, it makes it very clear that they disapprove of what's going on. And this could help seemingly in furthering some of the central reasons that we've looked at to engage in diplomatic criticism. It might be thought that to increase pressure on the wrongdoers by delegitimizing them and to make it clear that the wrongdoer contravenes morally important international norms. So this is an instrumental argument. You can make it very clear by cutting ties that you disapprove of the action, and this might appear to have some potential beneficial effects. The second is an intrinsic claim. Cutting ties, it might be thought, can remove any potential complicity in the wrongdoing. The sanctioning state can't appear, the state that's cutting ties won't appear to condone or enable the wrongdoing. It's not involved in it at all. without any ties, you can't be accused of playing a part in human rights violations or in external aggression. By contrast, if states maintain their presence within the aggressors, so if they maintain diplomats, ambassadors in the host state, and they still have lots of friendly relations with the state in question, they might be perceived to be condoning the wrongdoing. So the thought here brings us back to what we looked at last week with arms embargoes, where, if you recall, there was an argument that suggested we should engage in arms embargoes to avoid condoning and being complicit in mass atrocities. The thought here is similar. You should maintain clean hands intrinsically simply because this is the right thing to do, and so cut ties. To think about this, suppose that the human rights situation in Nigeria, that's been in the news the past week or so, gets much worse. Suppose this gets much worse, with the targeting of young people by the police significantly increasing even more, and citizens are killed at a very high rate. Do you think that the UK then should cut ties with Nigeria? Do you think that that would be a positive way to go about addressing the situation? Do you think other states should do something similar as well? Should we withdraw our diplomats? Now, one worry about doing so is that this can be counterproductive. The withdrawal of ambassadors and the cutting of diplomatic ties can firstly lead to a loss of intelligence. So it can make it more difficult for your state to understand what's going on in the state where there are atrocities or aggression, and then more difficult to understand how to respond to these. Secondly, it can make it more difficult to communicate clearly to the aggressor the complaint that you have, and to make it clear what needs to be done to address this. It's very difficult, much more difficult to communicate if you haven't got your ambassadors and your diplomats. One of the primary roles of an embassy is to communicate between the sender and the target state. In other words, communicate between the state that's engaged in the atrocities or aggression and the state that's thinking about criticizing, in order to explain decisions and to forge relationships. So embassies form a key role in communication. If you're cutting that, more difficult to condemn and to make clear your disapproval. So let me give you an example here. In 1989, the US cut and downgraded ties with Afghanistan and Sudan after a series of problematic incidents involving those countries. But this was very counterproductive. In the case of Afghanistan, the decision to cut democratic ties weakened the US's ability to make accurate decision-making in response to the rise of Osama bin Laden and the rise of the Taliban regime, and missed the chance to strengthen moderate sections of the Afghani society. It didn't have the intelligence to be able to understand what was going on, and lacked the forms of communication to be able to express what he thinks should happen. In the case of Sudan, diplomatic disengagement led to a lack of sufficient reliable intelligence on Sudan, and ultimately to mistaken airstrikes called the Al-Shifa airstrikes in 2002. They significantly strengthened anti-US feeling amongst radicals. There's one final issue as well, that the cutting and downgrading of ties might make it much harder in the longer term to maintain dialogue. So if we think that states should be engaged in dialogue over the longer term, diplomatic ties are absolutely necessary for this. Notwithstanding, you still might think that it's important to maintain clean hands important not to be complicit, depending on your viewpoint. And here we see again the tension between intrinsic and instrumental concerns that we've already seen quite a few times in this module. Okay, this brings us to the end of today's lecture. We've explored the case for diplomatic criticism in the first part of the lecture, looked at 3 reasons for this, drawing on constructivism, particularly for the first and second reasons. Then in the second half of the lecture, we looked at some of the objections to diplomatic criticism and looked at some of the alternative diplomatic measures, in particular, dialogue, mediation, and cutting diplomatic ties. Next week, we're going to be exploring non-violent measures to respond to mass atrocities and serious internal aggression and human rights abuses. Thank you.